Hi, everybody. I went on the Non-Sequitur show a few years ago. It was actually January of 2019. And I debated a person called Paulogia. And Paulogia is an atheist, and he has a very active YouTube channel and a YouTube following. And he often talks about the damage that this version of Christianity that he had followed in his early life had done to him. And so a lot of that has played out where he's making tons of videos against Christianity and specifically against Jesus and the resurrection. And so one of the things I did was when I was on Twitter, when I had an active, unprotected account on Twitter, I used to tweet things like this particular meme that you can see here on the screen. And so I will make it a little bit larger so you can get a better view here. But this is the meme that Paul found rather offensive because I said these were facts surrounding Christianity. And so this entire debate was started because Paul disagreed with what I said in this particular meme. And so I'm going to let Kyle, and so we've got a couple people here that we haven't seen in a while. So Kyle Curtis is one of he originally was a co-owner of this particular channel, Non-Sequitur channel, and Steve McRae. These are the two hosts. And Steve and I follow each other on Twitter currently on my protected account, but Kyle sort of lost out of touch, and apparently there was a big issue that went on between those two. But what ended up happening is right now Steve fully owns the channel and has somehow gotten it back. And so anyway, that's another story for another day. But let's go ahead and listen to what Kyle says. And I'll say hi to St. Tommy. Great to see you. So put that little deal in. Yay, we're all here. St. Tommy always reminds us to just remember the sacrifice that Jesus made for us, for our life, and for our salvation. And so let's listen to Kyle read off these original ones. Then I'm going to show you the meme that I created to address some of the issues that Paul found concerning. And then we'll talk a little bit about that and also about some new information that I've acquired since this time. And so this, again, was 3 years ago. And so since this time, I've acquired a little bit of new information concerning the longer ending of Mark, concerning Jewish burial practices, and a few other issues relevant to this video. So here we go.
We've got is Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. See secular historian Josephus. Number 2 was women first discovered his empty tomb, and no one claimed Jesus was buried anyplace else until about 1700 years later. His dead body was never produced. Number 3, all 4 Gospels attest to the fact that Jesus is risen. Number 4, Paul, who once hunted and persecuted Christians. Paul, I didn't know that you did that. It's not nice.
Yeah. While I was in the pews. Nasty.
Indicated he saw the risen Christ in 1 Corinthians 15, along with the 500, including the 12 apostles. Number 5, early Christians, including Paul, Peter, Stephen, and James, were often beaten, jailed, stoned, hung on crosses, and beheaded. They preached for decades, stating that they saw the risen Christ. Examples can be found in Acts, the epistles, and external writings by Polycarp, Pliny the Younger, and Tacitus. Number 6, Christianity was not legalized until 313 when Constantine legalized it. Number 7, Christianity started as a religion of peace, growing through the peaceful efforts of the apostles and disciples. And finally, number 8, by 313, Christianity had between 5 and 6 million adherents. See Geoffrey Warrow, 2008 Historical Atlas. So those are the 8 facts that SJ puts forth, and Paul has takes issue with a couple of those, and we're here to discuss what those are tonight. So which of the two of you would like to lay out your opening statements first?
So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to show you the revised slide that I created after addressing some of the issues that Paul had. So he even noted that he was a bit pedantic here, and he focused very specifically on some of the word choices that I had used. Like, he didn't like that I used the word facts. He did not like the word in a couple of cases where I had the word often, something occurred often, and he wanted clarification on that. He also had some choices. Like, so for example, I'm going to go back and I had a source, Geoffrey Warrow, for example, that said between 5 and 6 million Christians were following Christianity prior to its legalization under Constantine. Paulogia had other sources that thought that similar, about 4 million people were converted and were Christians during this time. And so different sources might say different things, and people make estimations about what they think in the ancient past. And it's based on scholarly activity and scholarly estimations, but obviously we don't really know which one would be perfect. And so I'm willing to open it up that we could have other examples. So anyway, here's the new slide that I'm going to show you just for a second. to go over this so you can see. There we go. So I'm going to show you this new slide. Let's see here. Share screen so you can see it. This is my revised slide based on addressing Paul's issues. And so you can see that I've changed a couple of things, updated over the past few years. So I've also changed the order. So here's what I would say are these 8 really important points or acceptable pieces of information surrounding Jesus. So number 1, he was crucified and he faced the ultimate punishment. So it's not just Josephus, as I mentioned before, but we also have support on this from Tacitus, Lucian, Celsus, the Talmud, and Martyr Serapion. These are ancient non-Christians who identified this issue and noticed that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. The 4 Gospels also said that women were first to discover Jesus' empty tomb, even though their testimonies were not valued. That's what I'll say right there. That's the 4 Gospels attest. Now, Paulogia made a point here. He said, well, Jewish burial practices suggest that women would be the first to the tomb. And he's correct about that. I actually went in there and I looked at some of the scholarly literature, and I found that there are some significant Jewish burial practices. Now, number 1, going back to Socrates' time, and this again comes from other scholarly work, but going back to Socrates' time, apparently women were really viewed as sort of really emotional types who were rather, they were the ones who were expected to be keening, which is another word for wailing, at the tomb. They were the ones who were supposed to go and apply the spices or the ointments or the anointing of the dead bodies. They were the ones who were supposed to be taking care of that. They were to show up on the 3rd day and follow specific procedures. So women were given a lot of these sorts of duties. And this supports, the Bible accounts support the fact that Jesus was given a dignified burial. Okay, so we've got the fact that Joseph of Arimathea asked Pontius Pilate to take Jesus down from the cross. Jesus had been anointed by Nicodemus using myrrh. You guys remember myrrh because of frankincense and myrrh. Those are 2 very important, very expensive, at the same level of gold. Those are 2 very expensive incense products and anointing products that were used a lot of times in the embalming process. And so myrrh was used by Nicodemus. And again, just like you remember, the Magi showed up with gold, frankincense, and myrrh at the beginning of Jesus' life. So we see myrrh both at the beginning and the end of Jesus' life. But anyway, so Joseph of Arimathea asked to take Jesus down from the cross. He did. He took care of Jesus' body. He put it into his own tomb. You'll recall that Isaiah said Jesus would be buried in a rich man's tomb. And so it said something to that effect that ended up playing out that way. So again, Jesus was in the tomb, and we have 0 ancient support to suggest there was any other sort of burial for Jesus. So you have atheists like John Crossan Dominic who get out there and they pretend that Jesus was given some sort of an undignified burial, but he has no ancient support to back up that claim. All of the ancient support we have, so it says that Jesus was buried in a tomb. And according to Matthew, that the Jewish people tried to cover that up, the fact that they couldn't find the body. You can only imagine that the Jewish people and the Romans were definitely looking for Jesus's body at that time because there was a huge uproar surrounding Christianity. But anyway, so it's in the tomb. So the women showed up on the 3rd day and they discovered that the body was no longer there. The other important thing about that is that women's testimonies were not valued. So the significance here is that, and Josephus said that, the significance here is not that they just happened to be the ones who showed up to anoint the body, because that was expected as part of Jewish burial practices, that women would do that chore. What is significant here is that the Gospels reported that the women were the first to discover the empty tomb. And even though their testimonies were not valued, the Gospels didn't go with the early church memorized creed, which didn't mention the women. So if you look at 1 Corinthians 15, the church decided to sort of exclude women initially in the references to which people Jesus appeared to. It said he appeared first to Peter, then to the 12, then to 500, some of whom were sleeping, then to James, Jesus' half-brother, then to Paul, the one abnormally formed. So the interesting thing there is that the church memorized that creed, excluding people like Mary Magdalene, even though 6 women were there at the tomb. But the gospel authors in their quest to tell the truth, even if the truth is a little bit embarrassing, and even if their testimonies were not valued, and women were considered too emotional, and all kinds of other negative traits. So we've got that sort of thing going on. Now, number 3, the only evidence of a burial other than the empty tomb came around 1700 years later. In other words, we have no ancient evidence to support John Dominic Crossan's assertions. I think I messed up the order of his name before, but I'll replace that. Number 4, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Paul hunted Christians. James thought Jesus had gone crazy. Can you imagine? Jesus' family tried to stop him. I don't think they really understood who he was and what his mission was. They had the words from Gabriel, who had shared with Mary that he would be a king. And they probably thought he'd be on the level of King Solomon or King David, a great earthly king who would reign from this gigantic, probably big castle and do all of that kind of stuff. But rather, that wasn't the plan. Jesus instead mixed around with the lepers and the prostitutes and the tax collectors. He did not try to go there and rub shoulders with the high-level people of his time. We also have number 5, early Christians were beaten, stoned, beheaded, and crucified. Just some examples. We have Paul, of course. Paul was beheaded under Nero. Stephen is the first apostle, the first disciple to be stoned. He was the first martyr in the book of Acts. We can see that. James, Zebedee's son, James, Jesus' half-brother, Peter and Paul also were given this sort of treatment. They were persecuted and martyred. Tacitus said that people were punished just for being Christians. They were scapegoats. They were the ones who Nero blamed the fire of Rome on. And he marched around in his chariot and burned them and made a big spectacle out of that. And Pliny the Younger noticed that people who would not recant for their Christian beliefs were punished for that way. They were killed if you would not renounce Christianity. We also saw Decian right around the year 250 do the similar thing. If Christians were not willing to worship the Roman gods, they were going to be killed. Okay, Diocletian around the year 303 made it illegal to be a Christian specifically, and he demanded that all Christian scriptures be destroyed. I'll just add those 2. Number 6, Christians had no legal protections until 313. In other words, Paul was upset about before that. He said, well, who had legal protections? Well, in certain situations, we had pagans with quite a few legal protections. That was the esteemed religion, this idea of the Roman gods. You were called an atheist if you were not a believer in the Roman gods, as we saw in some of the Colosseum activities where the Christians were denounced by the crowd as atheists because they didn't fall for the Roman gods. And again, just like I mentioned, Decian is an example of where if you would not worship the Roman gods, and in some cases, if you would not worship the Roman emperor, you would be destroyed. So by 313, Christianity had between 5 and 6 million adherents, according to Warrow. Of course, as I said, I am open to other estimations of how many people were busy at that time, but I do know it's into the millions. And then the last thing that Paul did not dispute was Christianity started as a religion of peace, growing through the peaceful efforts of disciples and apostles. And so those are my basic premises. And so I want to say hi as I come back over here to the chat. I see St. Tommy, Patrick Alexander, the Christian Resistance, Harry Stark. So yes, and Harry Stark, there are graphic, excruciating, public. These are not painless murders like getting poisoned or just injected with some sort of a chemical. So no, it's a horrible, horrible kind of disease that these people faced at that time. And so let's go back and hear what Paul has to say. So I'm going to offer a little bit of commentary on Paul's commentary, Paul's idea. And here we go. Okay, so let's listen in.
Either way,
Paul, did you want to go first?
Sure, I can. It'll be short. You know, as we already talked about, the interesting thing I've noticed, some of my followers who know anything about me, follow me at all, know that I hate memes in general. I'm anti-meme. If you've ever seen me on Genetically Modified Skeptic, he actually has me on just to torture me with memes. So they're not my favorite. So it's kind of ironic that that I would come on and to debate a meme. But and also SJ, I don't even follow SJ on Twitter. Her Twitter feed is so pervasive and gets forwarded around, and it's always just in our face. So this particular meme I'd seen, I don't think you posted this in December 1st.
I will point out something. I had a Twitter account that was very active. I had 21,000 followers. It was a big account. And I used to tweet things a lot of times that were just sort of, just sometimes it was a little bit of clickbait. And so I decided last year, December, actually January, almost a year ago, to just get rid of that entire account. It was becoming more of a liability and it was a big pain. I would get on there and I would just be bombarded by all kinds of tweeters and responders. I was devoting way too much attention to that silly thing. And so I got rid of it happily enough, and I couldn't be happier with my small little protected account that I have today.
I think I've seen it earlier than that, or at least earlier revisions of it. Anyway, so SJ posted this meme. The first time I saw it, forwarded or whatever it was facts about Christianity. And of course, she dares non-believers to try to reconcile what she believes are facts with a possible conclusion. Now, of course, one of the reasons why non-believers don't take her up on this is because generally non-believers don't accept that these are facts in any way. And I actually asked SJ before we started. I wasn't willing to do this unless we agreed to a definition of facts. Or actually, I just agreed to whatever definition she came up with, which she came up with things known or proven to be true, which is possibly problematic, but we're going to go with that tonight. Now, if possible, if there's time at the end, I would love to give SJ, or maybe in the after show, what my explanation would be for these facts, if indeed there are any facts in here. But that's not what we're here for tonight. We're here to just look at all 8 and go through and see if, in fact, there are any facts here. Some of them are straightforward assertions. Some of them are probable. Some of them have only a kernel of truth, so they're partially true, partially not. And others, I would say, are really nothing more than very carefully crafted statements that are true, but the way they are worded, the way they are phrased, tends to think that they will have implications far beyond what the actual fact supports, and we'll talk about.
Okay, so I'm going to just jump a little bit ahead here. So what I wanted to point out here is that Paul is disputing the wording that I had in my original meme, which I updated to show you the new wording and the one that I think he probably would not dispute so much. But I'm going to jump into the back end on this a little bit more, because this is where we get into some of the meat and potatoes, and I wanted to just make sure we get to some of the good stuff. So here we go.
Before, because I think you're probably salivating at the end of 1 Corinthians 15, so we'll jump there. First part of 4a, Paul, who once hunted and persecuted Christians. And it's always funny, a lot of people suggest I should change my name to Saul because I'm the reverse story of Paul. Paulogia, it has a good ring to it.
What I want to mention just prior to this one is he looked at this thing where I said all 4 Gospels attest to the fact that Jesus is risen, okay? And so at the time when I did this debate, I felt that the last passages, Mark 16, 9-20, were dubious. However, since that time, I've done a little bit of investigation. And what I found about the last passages in Mark 16, the longer ending of Mark, is I think that there could be a pretty good argument that this particular part of the book was written early. And just because it wasn't included in the 4th century codices by Sinaiticus and Vaticanus doesn't mean necessarily that we should exclude it from our Bibles. And I think that in many Bibles, of course, they do include it, but they include it with a hesitation or a footnote. And I think that if we look at the early events, now I went back and I looked at the earlier ending. Here's the earlier ending. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Then Mark 16 opens up. Now, it's possible that Mark could have added this a little bit later. Maybe that's why he starts with now at the beginning of Mark 16. Now, when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, for whom he had cast out 7 demons. You can compare that with Luke 8:2. She went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. You can compare that with Luke 24:11. Now, Jesus then appeared to 2 disciples. After these things, he appeared in another form to two of them. Okay, so we've got that sort of a thing. So here is what's going on. Jesus appeared to his disciples. He appeared in bodily form. He ate with them. He had fish with them, if you guys recall. Even the doubting Thomas was able to touch him. Mary wanted to hear him. Others were going to see him. So we can see that he presented himself in multi-modes. He presented himself to people alone, like when he appeared to Jesus or to James, his half-brother, and Mary Magdalene. And when he appeared in crowds, he appeared to a group of 500. He appeared to the 12 multiple times. And so we have all of that kind of stuff going on. Now, it says, after these things, he appeared in another form to two of them as they were walking into the country, and they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Afterward, he appeared to the 11 themselves, for they were reclining at table, and he rebuked them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who saw them after he had risen. And he said to them, go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation. Compare that with Matthew 28:16-20. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not will be condemned. In these signs will be accompanying those who believe. In my name, they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up serpents with their hands. And if they drink any deadly poison, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick and they will recover. Now, those are a couple of what I just read there. Some of those passages are unique to the book of Mark, right? So this idea of casting out demons, drinking deadly poison, the idea that he actually looked at his apostles and rebuked them. He rebuked his top apostles for their unbelief and hardness of heart. That is unique to the book of Mark. So the question is, if we can find support that is predating the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus, which are the primary texts that English translators have gone to try to create the Bible versions that we have today, if we can find information earlier than that supports some of those different unique verses, then we have support for the early, longer ending of Mark. Now let's read the last passages. So then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken to them, was taken up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. You can compare that with Psalm 110. And they went out and preached everywhere while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by accompanying signs. Compare that with 2 Corinthians 12:12, Acts 2:22, 8:6, and 14:3. Now, I'm just going to point out some places. There was a person called John William Burgon. So there was a person called John William Burgon, and he critiqued the Bishop Ellicott, and he lived between 1813 and 1888. Here's what he said. Similarly, concerning the last 12 verses of St. Mark, which you brand with suspicion and separate off from the rest of the gospel, in token that, in your opinion, there's a breach of continuity, whatever that may mean, between verses 8 and 9. Your ground for thus disallowing the last 12 verses of the gospel is that Vaticanus and Sinaiticus omit them, that a few late MSS exhibit a wretched alternative for them, and that Eusebius says they were often away. Now, my method, on the contrary, is to refer to all such questions to the consentient testimony of the most ancient authorities. And I invite you to note the result of such an appeal in the present instance. The verses in question, I find, are recognized in the 2nd century by the Old Latin and Syriac verses by Papias, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and in the 3rd century by the Coptic and Sahidic versions by Hippolytus, by Vincentius, and the 7th Council of Carthage, by the Acti Pilati, and by the Apostolical Constitutions in 2 places. Okay, so he's also got references that come in much later, but the bottom line is we've got a lot of references from prior to the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus in the 4th century that support it. Here, just to give you a little example, Papias, here's what Papias said, and this is around 110 AD. And John, okay, wait, let's see here. Papias. While we don't have Papias's 5-volume exposition of the Logia of the Lord, we do have references to his books from early church fathers such as Eusebius. In the 4th century, Eusebius wrote the Ecclesiastical History, in which he discussed Papias's book. He mentioned how Papias recorded that Justin Barsabas drank a deadly poison and experienced no ill effects. Okay, so we've got that, and we've got that support. Justin Martyr let's get to, Tatian, around 115, Tatian reconciled the four Gospels in his Diatessaron, though he excluded significant portions from the empty tomb accounts. He made several references to the longer passages of Mark, with one uniquely attributable to Mark's version of the empty tomb account. Quote, and on the first day on which he rose, he appeared first under Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. Justin Martyr, in his first apology to the Emperor Pius around 160, Justin Martyr conveyed words that parallel those in the longer ending of Mark. Here's what he said, quote, and that God the Father of all would bring Christ to heaven after he had raised him from the dead, relate that to Mark 16:14, and would keep him there until he has subdued his enemies, the devils, compare that with 16:17 in Psalm 110:1, and until the number of those who are foreknown by him as good and virtuous is complete, on whose account he has still delayed the consummation. Hear what was said by the prophet David. These are his words, quote in Psalm 10. The Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. Compare that with Mark 16:19. The Lord shall send to thee the rod of power out of Jerusalem, and rule thou in the midst of thine enemies. With thee is the government in the day of thy power, in the beauties of thy saints. From the womb of morning I have begotten thee. That which he says, he shall send to thee the rod of power out of Jerusalem, is predictive of the mighty word, which his apostles going forth from Jerusalem preached everywhere. Compare that with Mark 16:15. And though death is decreed against those who teach or all confess the name of Christ, Mark 16:16, we everywhere both embrace and teach it. Here's what Irenaeus says. This is around 170 in his book Against Heresies. Quote, also towards the conclusion of his gospel, Mark says, so then after the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sitteth on the right hand of God, confirming what had been spoken by the prophet. The Lord said to my Lord, sit thou on my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. Thus God and the Father are truly one and the same. He who was announced by the prophets and handed down by the true gospel, whom we Christians worship and love with a whole heart, as the maker of heaven and earth and of all things therein. Okay, so you can just see, those are just a few examples, and I could get into more, but I want to just let you know, again, these are written well before Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which are the ones that people have been using. But since we have earlier support, I suggest that that be something that we think about. And so here we go.
Paul, who once hunted and persecuted Christians, indicated that he saw the risen Christ in 1 Corinthians 15, and I'm going to stop there. Why did you phrase it? No, I'm going to read 1 Corinthians 15:8 says, last of all, he appeared to me also, where me is Paul. So the word there is appeared, and I checked translations. It's almost universally translated as appeared in verse 8. So how does that confidently let you say that he appeared bodily? I assume you've seen The Empire Strikes Back, right? I know you're barely old enough. But
no, I'm not a Star Wars fan. Sorry.
You've never seen Empire Strikes Back? Oh man.
I don't watch Star Wars. I've never seen any of the Star Wars. I'm sorry. I did see the 70s. So
the example I was going to give was Ben appearing to Luke, so as a ghost. So, but anytime a ghost appears to someone, that's actually the language that's used, right?
See, Paul is sort of, it's almost like splitting hairs here. It's, did somebody appear to somebody, or if somebody saw something? And the question is, in Paul's case, is what is the form that this person appeared? One of the things that Paul is going to do is he's going to talk about the way Jesus appeared to Paul on the road to Damascus. And I'm going to give you an example of where Jesus also appeared that usually isn't mentioned in just a second.
Right. Someone appeared to someone appeared to that. I guess the word appeared doesn't necessarily imply, doesn't have to imply physical body. And so I actually want to read you a few other verses that expand on this passage. I guess it's and you'll come to it that my assertion is that this was a vision. And so we'll go to Acts 9 verse 3. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I am Jesus whom you're persecuting. Let me skip ahead a couple verses. The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound, but did not see anyone. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So again, we're talking about a scenario where a bright light shone at him, and when he finally got his vision back, no one there saw anything. So this doesn't sound like a physical body.
So I will grant that in the book of Acts, we do see references to a bright light and a sound. We don't get a specific that is mentioned by Luke, who is the one who wrote the book of Acts. Luke does not tell us exactly the form that Jesus appeared on the road to Damascus. However, if we switch on over, let's jump ahead and go to Acts 23:11. And I'm just going to read this to you, what Acts 23:11 says. The following night, the Lord stood by him, this by Paul, and said, "Take courage. For as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." Now, you can make whatever assumption you want on the form that the Lord appeared to Paul. Paulogia would probably try to say, oh, it must have been in a vision or a ghost. We're not told that. In fact, it makes more sense that for the Lord to appear, and he said, stood by him. The Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage." Okay, so we've got a form that Paul could see, potentially feel, hear. We have all of that kind of stuff. Now you can, play word games and everything else and jump around here, but Jesus appeared and he encouraged Paul during his ministry. And of course, Paul mentions many other times where Jesus also was helping him to write his books. He said all the words that came in there were God breathed.
Let me go to Galatians 1:12. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. So if he saw Jesus as a man, why is this a revelation? This is, if he was seeing a Jesus he could talk to, if he was a physical body of Jesus, why did Paul describe it as a revelation? And the one you probably knew I was going to go to, 2 Corinthians 12, verses 1-5. I will go on boasting, although there is nothing to be gained. I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, and everyone agrees this is Paul talking about himself in third person.
Everyone does not agree to that. He says, I know a man 14 years ago. Who's this to say this is Paul talking about himself? That's something that's coming from Paulogia.
I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know, but God knows. And I know this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I don't know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things. So Paul doesn't know whether he saw Jesus's physical body or not.
That's a non sequitur. How ironic. That doesn't follow. Number one, Paulogia is assuming that this person he's speaking of is Paul. Paul speaking of himself. However, Paul doesn't say this is about him. He says it's about he knows a man. That is, he knows another object. Okay. Here you have the self knows a man. Doesn't say he knows myself. I was caught up into heaven. So let's not read into it. That's a big problem that I find a lot of atheists have. And I'm going to address that also when I look at Myth Vision's ridiculous take on the infancy narratives on Friday.
He talks about it in three separate passages as visions. So I guess I'm wondering if you can point me to any, because 1 Corinthians 15 is ambiguous.
I also want to say hi to people in the chat here. I see Cheshire Vic. I haven't seen her in forever. So good to see you, Cheshire, St. Tommy, Harry Stark, Zeng Fukusheng. So you guys welcome.
Can you point me to any passages that speak of Jesus, Paul seeing a physical Jesus? Is there any passages that you know?
And at the time, I look kind of shocked there. And at the time, I was thinking in the back of my mind about these kind of passages that Jesus had shown up and helped reveal the word to Paul. However, I really hadn't thought about Acts 23:11 that I just presented to you, where Jesus appeared and encouraged Paul. And so I would say that probably stood by Paul. Sounds like it would be a physical appearance, not something a ghost would do or a vision would do. A vision doesn't stand by you and a ghost doesn't stand by you. Okay, a actual person, a person in physical form could stand by you. So my best answer to this for Paulogia is Acts 23:11.
I think that Paul's statement, what he made in 1 Corinthians 15, and when he talked about the resurrection right there, I think that he basically said Jesus appeared to him. He didn't say a spirit of Jesus or a vision of Jesus. He basically he put himself on the exact same level as the other 12 disciples and the 500 people who saw Jesus. And we know that the other people who saw Jesus, as I mentioned earlier, they ate with Jesus. They spent 40 days with Jesus, not continuously, but at times he appeared over a 40-day period. So he didn't, in 1 Corinthians 15, he never said, and I'm the one who only saw him via vision, or I'm the only one who saw him via a spirit. He put himself on the exact same level as them. So I don't think it's, I think he would have said that I just saw a flash of light and assumed it was Jesus or that kind of thing. Instead, he basically put himself on that level. So I think that itself is enough to indicate to me that he saw Jesus in the same form that the others on whose level he's put himself.
Well, and of course, you've spoken to several people who would actually agree with you and say that all of them merely saw visions, right? That Paul exactly did put all those other occurrences on his level of vision. And that's why we go to these other, because appeared is very ambiguous. I guess I'm wondering how you can make this a historical fact. How can you make this a historical fact that we're supposed to explain when all these other passages? Sure.
So he said in 1 Corinthians 15, going on to verse 15, he says, more than that, we are then found to be false witnesses about God, for we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead. But he did not raise him if in fact the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ are lost. If only for his life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. So he basically made it pretty clear. The resurrection, if that didn't happen, Christianity is no good. I mean, that's the only point in Christianity that actually really makes a big difference to us. But also, let me note something.
Sure.
Now Paul traveled, just so you know, going back to the Gospels, Paul traveled with Luke, starting in Acts 16. That's recorded by Luke. He actually started speaking in the first person. So Acts 16 through the end of Acts, Luke and Paul were traveling together. Paul also met the other disciples. He actually met all of the apostles. There's a period in the book of Acts where he met with them. He knew Peter very well. He knew James, Jesus' brother, very well. He also traveled with other people like Bartholomew and Timothy. And so they were all, they weren't always together. A lot of times they were very far apart and very distant from each other, but they all knew each other. And so the eyewitnesses to Jesus, who were eyewitnesses to his ministry, also spent much time with Paul. So that gives a lot of credence to what Paul wrote with respect to the entire picture, because he was traveling with all of these people.
So a quick side note, I would encourage you, because I don't think Acts is true or written by Luke at all. I would encourage you to go to Galatians 4 if you ever want to make that argument again, because Galatians 4, I do believe, is written by Paul, and these were Peter and Paul met. So I would encourage you in future debates to use that, because someone like me is going to be more likely to accept it. Okay. However,
so let me go to, I want to say hi also to Taking Back Eden, Harry Stark. I don't know if I said hi to you guys before, Zheng Fukusheng. So I just wanted to point out, so let's go to Galatians 4, as Paul recommended, and see what exactly he says. Now, he does acknowledge that Paul wrote that. Let's see. He's discounting the Gospels. And so in just a second, I'm going to also give you a reference to the reason why we should support the Gospels that comes from ancient sources. And so we will get to that in just one moment. But let's see, for Paul, so first Galatians 4 starts out with sons and heirs, Paul's concern for the Galatians, the example of Hagar and Sarah. And so that's it. So let's see which verse he must be talking about. Okay, so brothers, I entreat you, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You did me no wrong. You know it was because of a bodily ailment that I preached the gospel to you at first. And though my condition was a trial to you, you did not scorn or despise me, but received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus. What then has become of your blessedness? For I testify to you that, if possible, you would have gouged out your eyes and given them to me. Okay, so Paul just said as an angel of God. I think maybe this is what Paulogia is speaking about, as an angel of God. But let's remember this. The word that they used, and when they spoke of angels in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, that is referring to messengers, so like a messenger of God. And so we also have angels who appeared all throughout the Old Testament, including lots of angels that probably are Jesus. Okay, so especially when the angel of the Lord appeared to Abraham and started speaking in the form of being God. that's something to note. But the idea is, in Paul's mind, I think, is that angels are something that are ethereal and not in earthly bodily form. However, we do have lots of examples, even in the New Testament, where it says you should treat people well because you never know if you're with an angel. Okay, so that's just a comment on that little part right there. And so here we go. Oh, I also want to, well, we'll get back to that in a second.
All the things you just said, none of it requires that Paul didn't see a vision of Jesus. Like the fact that he met with Peter and they got, and actually, and he and Peter didn't even get along, which
He's
is
right. And actually, that's one of those little embarrassing pieces of information about the New Testament that attributes reliability to it, because you think to yourself, if you're trying to craft a narrative in a sales pitch, you're not going to include parts like Paul and Peter, who were major icons in the early church, that they actually had a disagreement about something. Paul was of the opinion that people who were non-Christians originally did not have to be circumcised. Peter believed that they needed to follow the Jewish practices. And Paul's position ended up winning out. So anyway, I also want to comment, Layman Seminaries here with a really good comment. He wrongly divides event and text. The inspired text in Philippians 3:21 refers to how he will be conformed bodily to Jesus's body, okay? And that's something that you can also go back and look at the vineyard and a lot of the parables that Jesus shared about the vineyard, the owner of the vineyard, and how we're as grapes. He can graft us into the vineyard, or we can drop ourselves away from the vineyard, sort of the body of Christ.
it's fine. But the fact that they may have all commiserated and checked stories, that has nothing to do with whether Paul saw a physical body. I've given you 3 specific passages, the only 3 where he talks about this outside of it, where he talks about visions, where he talks about the fact that he saw nothing. If there was a physical body there on the road, if you're God, like, and then that would actually be a second coming, because you think that this happened after the ascension. So that means that Jesus came a second time to see Paul for like however many minutes it was, and then disappeared before anyone saw him again. Like, again, I don't see how with all this stuff to contest it, how you can possibly say that he saw a physical risen Jesus is a historical fact.
Okay,
I don't see how.
Paul has an issue with that. And again, I don't want to keep going back to Acts 23:11, but just remember in Acts 23:11, it said Jesus stood by Paul and encouraged him. And so it seems very likely it's physical. However, I would even say it seems silly to be arguing about whether he appeared in a physical way or he appeared in a vision or even in a dream. And I will say the reason I'm even mentioning the latter is because I believe through the centuries, Jesus has appeared to people in visions and dreams. And it's very specific in the Gospels and in the epistles that Jesus would appear in visions and dreams. Okay, so in the last days, he will appear in visions and dreams. And so, but I don't believe that he appeared in a vision. I don't think a vision stands next to you and encourages you. I don't think that makes any sense.
You have enough evidence. You've given me some maybes. Maybe this happened. Maybe that happened. And
good question. Cheshire Vic is saying, do we know if Paulogia is a mythicist? I don't think Paulogia is a mythicist, only because I've heard him say numerous times that he will grant us that Jesus was a person. Jesus was somebody who was around back then. I think Paul's theory, and I could be wrong, and I'll let him correct me on it if I am, but I think Paul's theory is that Jesus appeared and he was maybe a good person, maybe a great moral teacher, but he did not intend for us to worship him as God. I think that's a view that I even took a long time ago. I was sort of a progressive Christian who took that kind of view. But then Paul thinks that the church, the early church, ended up sort of running amok and creating their own narrative surrounding Jesus and turned him into a legend. And so that tends to be the view of some atheists. And so that's where they come from. And I can relate to that view because I partially held it back in my 30s. However, if you look into the evidence, the ancient evidence we have in support of the resurrection, and you also look at the reasoning behind why the apostles did what they did, whether they received any sort of material outcomes, which they didn't, and whether they thought that they were going to receive spiritual outcomes, which they did, we also have the case that these people said they saw the risen Christ. They didn't say they saw a spirit. They didn't say they saw a ghost, or they didn't say anything else like that. Instead, the Gospels reveal that Jesus appeared to them in bodily form and even ate with them. Let them see, hear, and feel him.
And people check their stories later. That doesn't reach the level of historical fact. If you want to say that in 1 Corinthians 15 that Paul indicated that why not use the word from the verse that Jesus appeared to Paul? That's the wording from the verse. Why wouldn't you use that?
I'm not really sure of the significance here, and I don't understand why it makes a difference if they saw Jesus or Jesus appeared to them. I think he's trying to say that if Jesus appeared to them, the appearance could be in multiple forms. I think that's what he's getting at, versus if they say they saw him, but who's to say they didn't see this different form? Okay, so that's, anyway, I'm not sure why he's making sort of a big deal out of this. But I will go into something really quickly with 1 Corinthians 15. A lot of people, including even Bart Ehrman and Gert Ludemann, attest that 1 Corinthians 15 is a very early creed that was passed down within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion.
I think I did use that verse. I mean, I read the actual verse.
But no, but in your new meme, you say he indicated he saw the risen Christ, which is what I contest. I don't think he saw the risen Christ. I think he saw a vision of Jesus, and the verse only.
Okay, well,
verse says.
That's where we differ, because I think if he merely saw a vision, I don't think it would have been as powerful for Paul, and it would have been something that would have convinced him to preach the way he did over decades and witness. He went through stoning, he had snake bites, he went through shipwrecks, he was jailed, he was beaten numerous times. He went through all kinds of things before he was finally beheaded by Nero, just so he could.
People change their lives for visions all the time.
Hold on, everybody. Let each other finish their statements.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. No, I'll let you go on. I actually have one more point because I want to bring up the Mike Winger thing.
I still don't see how this rises to historical fact. If it's so ambiguous, even within the one context you've given it, and I don't understand. You changed the wording of the verse. I don't know why you changed the wording of the verse. Why wouldn't you just use the wording that's in the verse that Jesus appeared to Paul? You're overextending. You're going beyond what the evidence can support, and you're certainly not in the realm of facts.
You know what? I will concede, if this will make you happy, I will change the wording to appeared, and I will change the meme. The next time you see the meme, it will say he appeared to Paul. Is that fair enough?
Awesome. I would love that.
Because I wanted to ask you a question, if it's okay.
Sure.
When I listened to your video with Mike Winger.
Oh yeah, we're fine. Go ahead, Dave.
Okay.
Sure.
When I listened to your video with Mike Winger, you actually also conceded two other people who had also indicated that they saw the risen Christ, and one of them you gave three. You gave Peter, you gave James, the brother of Jesus, the half brother of Jesus, and you gave Jude. Are you still okay with that? Because you actually conceded at that point that those additional three people had seen the risen Christ.
No, I said that those three people existed. I don't think that I conceded that they saw a risen Christ. Anyone saw a risen Christ. In fact,
or that they said, did you concede that they said they saw the risen Christ? Maybe I should put it that way.
No, I would concede that there are books written in their name. Like, I don't think that they wrote that they are attributed to them. I think those are forgeries outright. So no. I do think that Paul met those people though, and so if that's what we're talking about.
Okay, so
I will concede that Paul met
those people. Okay,
absolutely, Paul. I would agree with that, because again, I consider Galatians 4 to be much stronger. I feel that is probably written by Paul. And in the future, I'm being very sincere about that when I give you that recommendation, because it says basically the same thing as the Acts, but it doesn't have the stain of what's going on there.
So you hear that, the stain of what's going on. So one of the things that we just want to point out here is, hold on one second. One of the things we want to point out here is the reliability of the book of Acts. And so I think he's questioning its reliability. In fact, Paul believes that the four Gospels were initially anonymous. And I want to give you a few arguments that refute that point. Okay, so one of the big arguments that refutes that is, if you did not have attestation to anybody, the Gospels are not attributable to anybody, how does he think that they spread and were received in the churches so well if they came about from anonymous names? Number two, I also believe that you should take a look at the early letters and quotes from people like Ignatius. Ignatius, who was born in some year, he was martyred in 110 AD. So clearly he was in the 1st and 2nd century. Ignatius had letters with quotes from Matthew, Luke, Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, Colossians, and 1 Thessalonians. Papias, who was the bishop of Hierapolis between 60 and 130 AD, he lived between 60 and 130, he wrote this. He said, the elder also said this, Mark, being the interpreter of Peter, whatsoever he remembered, he wrote accurately, but not, however, in the order that these things were spoken or done by our Lord. And so he went on a little bit about that, but he noted Mark. He named Mark. And again, this is very early on. So this is in support of the authors. In fact, we have no ancient support for this anonymous theory. Okay, that came about hundreds of years later. All of the attributions to the Gospels go to the four authors and Acts. Of course, Luke is the one who's given the attribution of both Luke and Acts. And he talks about it up front that he wanted to write an orderly account to Theophilus. Eusebius also pointed out that James, Jesus' half-brother, is attributed the first of the general epistles. Okay, that's James, Jesus' half-brother. Eusebius is around 325. Polycarp, who lived between 69 and 156 when he was martyred, wrote a letter to the Philippians and included quotes from Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, Galatians, Ephesians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, 1st Peter, okay, should be noted for Paul, 1st John and 3rd John. Justin Martyr, who lived between 100 and 165, he wrote in his 1st and 2nd Apology and his dialogue with Trypho the Jew, letters that also included quotes from Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Revelation. Again, the books always are attributed to those same people, okay? And Clement of Alexandria, between 150 and 215, and Irenaeus, who was born in 130, named all four Gospels in the 2nd century, okay? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All right, so we just have, those are just a few pieces of evidence in support of the Gospel authors and the early attributions to the same people. We don't see any early attributions to anybody else. There's no alternatives. Nobody said, oh, the Gospel of Mark, no, that was really written by Tony. No, we don't see any of that. We see the attributions to the same named four authors that the church has historically approved.
Okay, so we move on, along with the 500, including the 12 apostles. Now, I'm not reading from Great Corinthians there. I'm reading from your meme. Tell me a little bit. So that's a creed. Can you tell the audience a little bit about why that's a creed, what you think is special about the creed? I'm assuming you think it's pretty early.
Yeah, and thank you for asking. I love this particular creed. So this creed was one of the first that was memorized in the church, and everyone, even including people like Bart Ehrman, have actually supported the idea that this creed is very early. A lot of people think that it's within the first 5 years after Jesus' resurrection. Now, from the different areas that I have looked, it appears that Jesus resurrected on April 3rd of 33. So my guess is that this creed was written sometime before 38 or so. And around that same period of time, within that period of time, the estimates that I've seen indicate that Paul also started having his experiences, had his experiences with Jesus and had started his ministry at that point during this time. So he heard this creed, it was passed down to him, and that's what he repeated in 1 Corinthians 15. So it's something that's probably one of the best testimonies to Christianity and its early roots.
And I just want to piggyback on what I just said there, just to give you some other support. Here's what Ulrich Wilchen said, quote, about 1 Corinthians 15. And this is coming from David Wood and his debate. Indubitably goes back to the oldest phase of all in the history of primitive Christianity. Gert Ludemann, quote, the elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Robert Funk, in the Jesus Seminar, written 2 or 3 years at most. Richard Hayes, quote, written about 3 years after Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. Alexander Wedderburn, first half of the 30s. Richard Barnett, written 2 or 3 years of the first Easter. Richard Burridge and Graham Gould, from only a few years after Jesus' death. Okay, so we've got some other support for the early attestation. Now, if we only had 1 Corinthians 15, that's all we had. We had no Bible. We had no other information. I think we've got enough right there to support Jesus' resurrection.
So do you think that Paul, given that he was repeating a creed, was actually in a position to affirm that the 500 people saw it, or that the 12 apostles saw it? Or was this merely what he heard that other people believed?
Well, actually, that's really a great question, because right within the creed, it indicates that some of the people who had seen Jesus in the 500 had fallen asleep. And so what that also tells us, that also means that some were still alive. And so while he's repeating the creed, he could have been called out by the people who were in these crowds. And again, it was kind of from a small area, small towns. And he could have been called out and said, hey, you're lying. This never happened. Because he could say, well, Johnny over here saw it and Susie over there saw it and that kind of thing. So he actually had something where there were witnesses at the time who could have called him out for lying. And from all indications, I don't see that anyone has.
How would that have worked? So I don't know if you don't follow me on Twitter, I don't think. But a few times I've posted on Twitter.
No, but you and I can DM each other for some weird reason.
Oh, mine are
I have
open.
no idea how
Anyone
that
can DM me.
Anyone
can DM me.
Okay, because I was like, how can I DM Paul? I'm DMing him. We're not following each other. We should start. I'm going to follow you, Paul. Sorry, I'm going to follow you.
All right. So I've run examples on there where I've said, you know what? Outside of Calgary last night in one of the little towns around here, David Bowie performed a concert. 500 of us saw it. It was amazing. If you doubt this, someone who wasn't there should come and tell you. How would that have worked? How would it possibly have worked that everyone's sitting around saying, boy, I wasn't one of the 500. I should stand up and say something. How is that a reasonable thing? Like, you don't, I wasn't there, so I'm going to put up my hand and contest this.
So let's talk about what Paul is talking about here. Now think about, let's bring ourselves back into the early church and consider exactly what Paul is saying and what that creed was telling us. Okay, the creed was telling us that Jesus appeared multimodally. He appeared into groups, he appeared to individuals, he appeared to a very large group of 500. Now, does that mean for sure we have 500? We've got all of those names? No, we don't. We don't have a record of the names of the 500 people. That's very true. But what this tells us is, if you think about how this would play out, if you were among the 500 and imagine that you felt called to go spread the good news after you were part of this group, you maybe joined some of the apostles, Silas, Barsabbas, Priscilla, Aquila. There were a lot of people out there who were going around sharing the good news, who were working with Paul and who were working with Peter. Lots of people were out there sharing the good news. And so we would guess that we would have the major sources. If you were really curious about it and you were outside the 500, you could go into the church in any of these locations. You could go into the temples and you could find people who would probably know about the way. And you would say, and it was called the way back then, you say, I'd like to go talk to Peter. I need to find Peter to ask about this. Or I'd like to find Paul to ask about this. Or I want to find Mary Magdalene or any other people who were out there who were known as eyewitnesses. And you could go to them and you'd hear their stories. And of course, their stories weren't unique to only them. Each of those people would have undoubtedly shared the good word with their families and their close friends. And so this whole thing would ripple effect. It would have a huge ripple effect on the whole ancient Near East. And it did. And so we see in the book of Acts where people say that thousands of people keep getting converted each day. People just keep learning of the good news and it keeps growing and becoming more prevalent. And so it's one of those things where you would be able to easily access the original sources by simply going into the churches or tracking down people who were spreading the good news in homes.
Is that a reasonable thing to do? To expect to have happened?
To say I wasn't there? No. But I would think that if he were telling a lie, in a creed that wasn't something that was passed down, and he was saying that Jesus appeared to these people, if you have the people basically also have families and extended groups, and they're probably spreading the news. So there's probably, you can imagine back in those times, it's not like these days when it's modern.
But let's say it was made up. Let's say it was made up or didn't happen. Who could possibly stand up and say, I didn't see it? Because obviously most of the world didn't see it. So I guess I just don't see how this go ask one of the 500. We don't know who they were. No one knows who they were. It's never attested. I don't know how anyone's supposed to be asked, nor how someone who wasn't there is supposed to stand up and say, I wasn't there, and not to mean anything.
Well, it's actually a point. I can agree. Okay, let's go back to Paul. It's fair to say, hey, wait a second. I didn't see it. Say I'm living in the ancient Near East. Maybe I'm living in Judea and I'm in my little town and I start hearing about it, but I wasn't a witness myself. And so what do? I say, I didn't see it. Well, I have a choice. I can either go talk to people who did see it, or I can just bury my head in the ground and not pay any attention to what people are talking about. I can ignore it. Once I hear it, maybe I go talk to a few people. I hunt down Peter, I hunt down Paul, I go find Priscilla, Phoebe, Lydia. I go find all of these people who are sharing the good news. Barsabbas, Silas, Stephen. We have a lot of people there I could go and talk to who had seen the risen Christ, and maybe those people hadn't seen the risen Christ, but they would know people who had seen the risen Christ. And so I could go get the original sources through these people who were out there sharing the good news. And then I make a choice. The choice is, do I want to believe this information, or do I want to reject it? And I'm certain that there were people back in those days who chose to reject it. Some chose to believe, as we know, and some chose to reject it. And that's just a choice God's given us. He doesn't force himself on anybody. That's actually one of the beauties of the Christian faith, is we don't force our faith on anybody. Not to say we haven't in history. We have a horrible history in the Crusades where we were forcing our faith on people, but not today. People have wisened up and realized that the original message of Jesus did not tell us to do that. People are given a choice. And if people want to reject God, Romans 1:20 says that God lets them reject him. God lets them go their own ways and live out their lives as they please. So that's what we know. I want to say hi also to people like, yeah, okay, so Dapper Dinosaur says that Steve has his channel back. That's great. Yeah, so I mean, that's a little thing there. I also want to say hi to Trinity Radio, Evidence and Reasons, Taking Back Eden, Zhang Fukusheng. So good to see all of you guys. I saw Kip Davis a little bit before. Of course, he likes to get in here to refute anything I say, but that's okay. That's fair. You know, you're fully allowed to do that.
Well, actually, that's another good point, because you have to remember that the apostles themselves were going around and influencing people. So you've got Peter leading different groups. You've got James, Jesus's brother, who was basically running the church in Jerusalem. So there were figureheads all around in these different churches who were planted. So maybe he didn't name the 500, but there were certainly some named people within the apostles. And then, of course, there
Let's
were
save
some
that for number
apostles who were
5.
never named.
Cool. All right.
What's that?
I guess
Hold on,
you say that for number 5.
Want to go to number 5?
Yeah, I don't
No,
think she
you're
was finished with.
Oh, I'm sorry. All I wanted to say was I definitely want to talk about what you're talking about in number 5. So I want number 4. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, no, we can go to number 5.
Well, no, I'm okay. I guess all I want to say this one is that Paul was not one of the 500, nor is he one of the 12. So he certainly couldn't have attested to this. All he can attest was that other people believed it. Would you agree with that?
Well, he attested to the creed.
So here's the point that Paul is making. I don't know if you can see the screen here very well, but it says early Christians, early Christians, in parentheses, including Paul, Peter, Stephen, and James, were often beaten, jailed, stoned, hung on crosses, or beheaded. They preached for decades, stating that they saw the risen Christ. Examples can be found in Acts, the epistles, and in external writings by Polycarp, Pliny the Younger, and Tacitus. I just want to point out, so we've got the earliest people who were martyred. We've got people like Stephen, who was martyred at the feet of St. Paul. Okay, so that was when Paul was approving the killing of Christians. The likelihood that just a mere vision or a ghost appeared to Paul, who was at that time completely hostile against Christians and had his walking papers to be able to kill Christians, and was approving of Stephen's stoning, the likelihood that a mere vision or a ghost or even some sort of a dream or a hallucination would change Paul the way it did to get him into preaching. Now, people have guessed that Paul started his ministry maybe around 2 years, or he was on the road to Damascus just a couple of years after Jesus was crucified. Then he repented for a while, he prayed, he was in Damascus for a while. Then he went out on the path, and we can trace him all throughout the ancient Near East. He, in fact, went to all of these different areas that Jesus was reclaiming. Go back to Michael Heiser and watch what he wrote with respect to Psalm 82 and Deuteronomy and Genesis. He talks a lot about the gods, the Lord said to my, there's the calling of that these other gods, these spiritual beings had been given access to all of these lands in the ancient Near East. They had been given some sort of authority, and Jesus was reclaiming it back from them because they had been misbehaving. And that's really an interesting stuff, but I'm not going to go down that tangent too much. But the bottom line is that Paul went all around the kingdom over a good period of time, and people have guessed that he was beheaded by Nero, not guessed, but estimated somewhere in the early 60s. Peter also, history says that he was crucified upside down. We do know from ancient sources that he was definitely martyred. Sean McDowell has questioned whether he was crucified upside down, as the Catholic Church is taught, and that sort of thing. But regardless, he was martyred, and that occurred right around Rome in the Basilica. Stephen, of course, was stoned. And then we have James, both Jesus's half-brother, Josephus reports, was martyred. And James, the son of Zebedee, the brother of John, he also was martyred according to the book of Acts. So we have Paul reporting many issues that happened to him during his time. In fact, he knew that it was hardest for him. He was the most ardent of the apostles, and he was also the most unique in that he didn't come from Christianity at start. He wasn't a follower of Jesus during Jesus' ministry. He came to Christianity later, and he ended up being punished probably the most. He was jailed multiple times. He was stoned. A bunch of Jewish people, if you go to the book of Acts, you can see 40 Pharisees took a vow that they were going to starve themselves until they killed Paul. I mean, Paul was being chased and hunted his entire ministry. Imagine living like that for all those years. Very, very difficult. So anyway, so here we go.
Like, he basically presented the creed that they were all saying in the church. And then he said at the very end of it, and by the way, he also appeared to me as the one abnormally born.
Right.
So.
But your point 4 is worded such a way that Paul is attesting to these other things, which he couldn't have known. I guess I'm going back to the wording of your meme. He's just reciting.
Well,
he's reciting a nursery rhyme.
You did grant me.
Go ahead.
You did grant me that he also knew Peter, and he knew James, and he knew Jude. So you did grant me that, and so you granted me that he knew people who could testify to this.
Yeah, but that's not what he's doing here. He's repeating a rhyme. We don't know if this was written before or after he met with Peter, for example. We don't know that. I won't stick on it too much because I want to get to the other points. But this is not something Paul could have attested to. As your point lays, your point says that Paul attested to this, and he couldn't have. He certainly knew that other people believed it, but he didn't know himself. But let's go to number 5. Early Christians, including Paul, Peter, Stephen, and James, were often beaten, jailed, stoned, hung on crosses, and beheaded. And I want to stop there. And I want to say something quickly first. Obviously, all religious persecution I'm against is terrible. It doesn't matter whether it's one person or many people. Religious persecution of all kinds I think we can all agree, even if there was only one case of it, is awful, should never happen, all that kind of stuff. So I'm not wanting to in any way diminish the sacrifices that people made for what they believed or whatever the case was. But we're talking today about facts. So I want to just set that emotional stuff aside for a minute. There's some very emotional words: beaten, jailed, stoned.
And let's see what Paul's emotional words are. So if you go to 2 Corinthians 11, number 16, I repeat, let no one think me foolish, but even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. What I am saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. For you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. For you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. To my shame, I must say we were weak for that. Okay, so he's talking again about what happened. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. What they would do is they wanted to make sure the Roman law, they were not allowed to lash people or whip people more than 40 times. And so they always would just do less one just to be sure they didn't accidentally miscount. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak? And I am not weak. Who is made to fall? And I am not indignant. Okay, so you can just see right here all of the issues that Paul went through. And I think that Paulogia would acknowledge that, he'd be okay with that.
Just want to talk about, because we're talking about the facts here today. So I wanted to focus a little bit on the word often. Now, in most historical studies, I think, sorry, again, this is a little emotional, but we're talking about the facts of this. So when you say often, you mentioned a few people. You mentioned Pliny the Younger. You mentioned Polycarp, who certainly didn't have a good go of it, and a few others. Most historians will accept all of those because they're very exceptional things. I want to read a little bit of an excerpt from Triumph of Christianity, which is a recent book on the history of the Christianity. At the outset, I need to stress that organized opposition to the Christians came, for the most part, in isolated incidents. The church did not experience perennial violent persecution. The idea that Christianity was an illegal religion under constant surveillance by state apparatus that inflicted martyrdom on many thousands of believers, forcing the church underground onto Roman catacombs, is all more the stuff of Hollywood than of history. Christianity was not declared illegal in the empire before the middle of the 3rd century. There were no empire-wide laws or decrees issued in the central authorities in Rome that prescribed the faith. Christians did not, as a rule, go into hiding. For the most part, they lived perfectly normal lives in the midst of other people who practiced a wide variety of other religions, blah, 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 etc. Most historians agree that this was not an often fact, and again, it depends entirely on what you mean by often. So that's a weird word to include in something you want to say about as fact. But not only every time we have recorded history of where they were persecuted prior to 300, the charge was never that they were Christian. No one was ever arrested for being Christian. Everyone you listed, including Paul, Peter, Stephen, and James, were arrested for being troublemakers, were arrested for causing problems, for breaking other laws, for stirring up crowds. There was nothing in the religion itself that was a problem. Christians who kept their head down, Christian who formed the communities you're talking about that looked after the widows, the ones that are described in Acts, none of those people were ever persecuted.
Okay, so I want to acknowledge some of Paul's points here. One of the points that he's making is he's saying that persecution was not going on the entire time between, say, the year 33 AD and 313, when Constantine legalized Christianity and gave Christians legal rights. He's saying also that Christianity was not considered an illegal religion. However, we have to note a few things. Let's note that he did acknowledge that in the mid of the 3rd century, now this was who we're going to refer to here as Decian. Decian was a Roman emperor, and what Decian did in the middle of the 3rd century was he demanded that Christians worship the Roman gods. Anyone who did not worship the Roman gods was put to death. We also have Diocletian, who came about in 303 AD. Diocletian decided that he was going to demand that people worship Rome rather than worship Christianity. He wanted to exterminate Christians and Christianity, and he demanded that any Christian scriptures found be destroyed. It's a wonder that any of them have lived. And we also, of course, had people like Nero. And so Tacitus tells us exactly what Nero did. Quote, here's from Tacitus: mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Oh, wait, let's start from the beginning. Okay, so there was a report of a fire in Rome. So Paulogia is trying to say that because people were Christians, they were not persecuted. However, this goes in direct contrast to what Tacitus said. Tacitus lived between 56 and 117. He is a Roman historian. Here's what it says. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius. That was between 14 and 37 AD. At the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but the glut, one man's cruelty, that they were being destroyed. Okay, Tacitus very much cared about accuracy, as you can see from his Annals 4:10 and 4:11. Also, Pliny the Younger. Now, here's the deal. This is, again, Paul saying that people were not persecuted for being Christians. He's reading a quote where somebody else made that assumption. But here's what Pliny the Younger said. And this, he lived between 61 and 113 AD. Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, okay, Paulogia, Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I interrogated them as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. For I had no doubt that, whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness, and inflexible obstinacy, surely deserved to be punished. Okay, so he's doing it just because they're Christians. He was writing a letter to the Emperor Trajan. And then here's what Trajan says. You observe proper procedure, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those who have been denounced to you as Christians. Again, so this is completely refuting what Paul said. Here we go.
None of those people, I shouldn't say wherever, it was very rare that they were persecuted. And when they were, it wasn't because they were Christians. They were rare because they were persecuted, again, by the ones you listed, by Josephus, by Pliny the Younger, and Polycarp.
So I just read Pliny the Younger to you, so you can see that Paulogia is unfortunately in error here.
You mentioned Tacitus, pardon me. Tacitus, Polycarp, and Pliny the Younger. All of those cases were for stirring up trouble. They weren't for the religion.
But you heard what they said, of course. Because they were Christians, they were arrested. I just want to make sure that you guys heard that. The quote makes it quite clear. Paul is completely mistaken here.
So I guess, how am I supposed to accept the word often in this sentence? And what do you mean by often?
And you bring up a good point, because I was just trying to find if I had printed out a blog that I wrote a while ago about Christian persecution in the first 300 years, because yes, I agree with you. It was sporadic in the first 300 years. Okay, until they were granted legal protections by Constantine in 313, it was absolutely sporadic. There were times when it was horrific to be a Christian, and there were other times when it was kind of smooth sailing. Under Decian, which is right before Constantine, it was horrific to be a Christian. He persecuted them in horrible ways. Under Nero, it was pretty bad. Like Tacitus, as you noted, did point out that the Christians were scapegoats. They were the ones who took the blame for the fire in Rome, and they were the ones that Tacitus had pointed out that Nero used to enjoy burning them, putting them up on in crucifixion, doing all kinds of things in front of people in the Colosseum. He totally abused Christians at that point, and that was documented by Tacitus. So it was sporadic. But my point was, and I was basically really trying to focus on Peter, Paul, James, and Stephen and others like them, was in those first few decades after Jesus' crucifixion, it was pretty bad to be a Christian. Paul was being chased. In fact, I just wrote a blog on the thorn in Paul's side.
Was it bad to be a Christian, or was it bad to be a Christian, or was it bad to be one of these four guys?
Well,
let's say both. I don't think there needs to be a dichotomy there. So I want to point out what evidence and reasons. That's my friend Sal Cordova. He says Justin Martyr, AD 162, for not sacrificing to the gods. So people were persecuted for not sacrificing to the gods. It was much safer to be a pagan during this time and to worship the Roman gods, and to certainly worship the Roman emperor. And so the prefect Rusticus, those who do not wish to sacrifice to the gods and to obey the emperor will be scourged and beheaded according to laws. Okay, so you can just see right there. And so here we go.
Well, it was bad to be a Christian. You're right. And actually the combination was probably lethal. So the fact that they're a Christian and they're also stirring things up, you've got the Jews against him, you've got the pagans against him, you've got the Romans against him, you've got people who just don't want to see these people move about. And that brings me to something that I think is a lot of people who claim that Jesus is not a historical figure might not realize that something that was unearthed not too long ago in the late 1800s, the Nazarene Decree. Claudius, the emperor of Rome, from 41 to 55, issued a decree in which he stated that anyone found digging up a body would face capital punishment. And why would he do something like that? So he did that because what happened with Jesus was they basically, it's the claim of, obviously, if they think.
I'm kind of stumbling here over my words, but what I was trying to say in this particular instance is I was just talking about the reason why they would create such a decree is because they did not want another empty tomb to be found, because they felt that, these are people who did not believe that Jesus has resurrected. Some felt that the body had been taken from the tomb by the apostles. And so there was a decree that came about somewhere between 41 and 55 AD that said that we do not want anybody to go down and take bodies out of tombs, because they didn't want to see something similar. You have to remember, even in the book of Acts, it talks about the early Christians changing the world. They shook the world. They put it on its feet. Yes, they were making a lot of noise. Yes, it was a big deal. Yes, the early Christians were causing quite a stir. And this was something that was bugging some of the early people in the Jewish faith and in the Roman faith. Now, Paul later is going to ask me whether other religions were persecuted. And in this video, I did not even think to talk about the Jewish people. But of course, Jewish people were heavily persecuted in the year 70. You'll remember when the war broke out, we had the Romans tear down the Jewish temple. The second Jewish temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And we also had the wars in the early 2nd century with Jewish people. So they certainly were also being persecuted. And sadly, Jewish people have been persecuted through the centuries, all the way up until, I can't even say it's ended. I can still see stuff going on today here in the United States. 2022, we still see Jewish persecution going on. And it's probably one of those things where you can think about the spiritual battle behind the whole thing. These are people of God, people of the Lord, people who are the chosen people. So we see persecution going on in the chosen people. You would expect that if we have a spiritual battle going on. And so my dog is back there shaking. I just want to say thank you so much, everybody, for coming in here. This is what I'm going to play today, but I hope you guys will like and subscribe. I am going to be watching Myth Vision's video, and I have it in my YouTube lineup right now, but I'm going to be watching Myth Vision's video at noon, right around noon on in 2 days from now on Friday. And so I'm going to be watching the videos. That's what I'm pointing out. And so I'm going to be reviewing it, because what happens a lot that's actually a really sad thing is when people go to read the infancy narratives, they assert their own assumptions. And this is going to be a case in point of people asserting their own assumptions rather than simply reading the text for what it offers and not inserting your own assumptions. And so we're going to see how easy it is to read the text. And if you want to take a look at it before Friday, just read Luke first, then read Mark, then question which assumptions you have regarding either of those. Luke talks about the first 8 days of Jesus' life, right? And then Mark kind of continues it, but gives you a 2-year time period. Now, in that video that I watched, they're going to talk about how Jesus was in Egypt for 2 years. Where's that in the text? It's not specified, but that kind of thing is a sort of thing that we see from people who are unable to read the text for what it offers. And so we're just going to see more on that. So I want to say thank you so much to everybody who's in the chat. I hope you guys will like, subscribe, and do come again. Thank you, Kent Smith. Calls me Sister Thomason. I like that. So it's great to see you guys. Blaster Master taking back Eden, Kent Smith, Kip Davis. So we who else we have here? LB. So my son has just opened the door up, which is one of the reasons why I'm going to cut this video a little bit short. But we think he might have COVID, so we're going to take him to the doctors right now and get him tested. So, and that would be pretty unfortunate because my entire sister's family just got diagnosed with COVID. We were all together skiing last week, and my brother, his family got COVID. Actually, I can't say my entire sister's family. My sister has COVID. Her family's getting tested, and my brother's family of 4 all diagnosed positive for COVID. And so we've got a little fear here. So I had to hold both of my kids back from school. We are going to get tested. And so that's the plan. Now, if I have COVID, it's an extremely minor case, thankfully, but it's, I would say that's speaking to the Omicron variant. But anyway, you guys have a great day. Please like, subscribe, and do come again. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.